The wedding drums stopped mid-beat. The king's hand shot up in the middle of the ceremony, and 300 guests froze where they stood. He was staring at a bride's bare shoulder, at a small, dark mark shaped like a bird with open wings. The kind of mark a mother sews into cloth, not the kind a poor farmer's daughter is supposed to be born with. Where? The king said, and his voice did not sound like a king's voice anymore. Did you get that, Mark? Nobody in that courtyard understood the question. Only one woman did, and she had spent 19 years making certain nobody ever asked it. That woman was the bride's own stepmother, and she had just watched everything she buried come up out of the ground at once. Before we continue, please like this video and subscribe so you never miss a story, and tell us in the comments, where are you watching from today? Her name was Nkechi. She was 19 years old, and for as long as she could remember, the mark on her left shoulder had been the first thing anyone noticed about her and the last thing anyone forgave her for. It had shaped the whole architecture of how strangers greeted her, a flicker of surprise, quickly masked, followed by a carefully neutral politeness that fooled no one, least of all her. It sat just below her collarbone, dark against her skin, unmistakably shaped like a small bird in flight, wings spread wide, each individual feather rendered with a precision no ordinary birthmark should have carried. As a child, she had thought it was beautiful. She had shown it to other children proudly. At 4 and 5 years old, tracing the outline of the wings with her own small finger and telling anyone who would listen that she had been born already flying. That pride lasted exactly as long as her innocence did. The way children show off anything that makes them different in a way they don't yet understand can be dangerous. Her stepmother had cured her of that pride within a year. Ugly thing, Mama Uzoma used to say, catching sight of it while Nkechi bathed or dressed. No man will want a wife marked like a cursed bird. Cover it. Always cover it. So, Nkechi covered it. She wore wrappers with a shoulder cloth even in the worst heat, and by the time she was old enough to understand shame, she had learned to feel it automatically. The way she felt hunger or tiredness, a simple fact of her body that she had stopped questioning. By the time she reached her teenage years, the covering had become so habitual that she sometimes forgot, for whole days at a time, that anything unusual sat beneath the cloth at all. It was only in quiet moments, bathing at the stream before dawn, changing in the privacy of her own small corner of the room, that she remembered the shape of the mark clearly, traced it with one finger, and wondered, briefly and without any real hope of an answer, what it might mean to a person who had not spent her whole life being told it meant nothing good. The village of their childhood was small enough that everyone knew everyone else's business, and small enough, too, that the particular arrangement of that household had never once been questioned by any outsider. The house Nkechi grew up in belonged, in every way that mattered, to her stepsister Kelechi. Kelechi was 2 years older, soft, where Nkechi was work-hardened, and she had never once in her life carried water before sunrise or gone to bed with an empty stomach so someone else could eat. Mama Uzoma doted on her own daughter with a warmth that never once extended to the girl she had raised alongside her. It was true, and impossible to ignore once she was old enough to notice it. Kelechi had her mother's round face, an easy laugh. Nkechi had neither, and shared no visible trait at all with anyone in that household. Nkechi had asked, once, as a small child, why she looked nothing like anyone else in that house. Not Mama Uzoma, not even her father Emeka, who had raised her with more visible tenderness than either of them ever gave Kelechi, which was Nkechi, would later understand the whole root of everything that came after. You were a gift, her father told her, the only time he ever answered the question directly. I found you when you were very small, and I have never once regretted keeping you. That is all you need to know, and all I am able to tell you. He died when Nkechi was 13, of a wasting sickness that took him slowly over a bad year. In his final months, weak as it was, he had still found ways to be gentle with her, a hand on her shoulder, exactly over the mark, a habit she had never fully understood until she was much older. She remembered sitting beside his sickbed one evening, only weeks before the end, when he had opened his mouth, as though to finally explain something important, and then closed it again, shaking his head slightly. Not yet, he had said, more to himself than to her. I am not ready to lose you to a truth I cannot control. She had not understood what he meant. She had simply held his hand until he slept. Whatever else he had meant to tell her, whatever promise he had meant to keep, he took it into the ground with him. After that, the house belonged entirely to Mama Uzoma, and the difference showed within a season. Nkechi rose before the sun, and did not stop moving until well after it set. She carried water, worked the farm, cooked, cleaned, and mended, and she did all of it while covering a birthmark that had somehow, in her stepmother's telling, become the explanation for every misfortune in that household: a bad harvest, a sick goat, a suitor who changed his mind about Nkechi. That mark brings nothing but trouble, Mama Uzoma would say. I should have left you where I found you, where your father found you. I mean, the slip happened often enough that Nkechi had noticed it, though she never understood what it meant. Once, when Nkechi was perhaps 11, she had pressed the question a little further than usual. Where did he find me, Mama? Mama Uzoma's face had closed like a door. Somewhere far from here. It does not matter where. What matters is that you are fed and clothed and permitted to remain, which is more than many orphans are ever offered. The conversation had ended there, as it always did, and Nkechi had learned, slowly and thoroughly, not to ask a second time. There was a particular kind of cruelty that came not from malice, but from comparison, and Nkechi encountered it most often at the village market, where the two girls were sent together most weeks to sell whatever the farm had produced. Traders and neighbors alike had long ago settled into a habit of praising Kaliki's looks, her manner, her prospects, while Nkechi stood a half-step behind, with the baskets, rarely addressed directly at all. Such a pretty daughter you have raised, Mama Uzoma, a trader once said. Within Nkechi's hearing, without a single glance, toward the girl standing beside Kelechi, carrying twice the weight in baskets, Mama Uzoma had simply smiled and agreed, and Nkechi had learned, from moments exactly like that one, that invisibility was not always cruelty shouted loudly. Sometimes it was only cruelty that never bothered to include her at all. Kelechi, for her part, was not especially cruel. She simply accepted her comfort as her due, the way a person accepts, whether, and never once thought to ask why her stepsister's portion of that comfort was always so much smaller than her own. There was one ritual that captured the whole shape of her life, better than any single insult could. Every evening, when the cooking pot was finally empty, and the family sat together to eat, Nkechi stood at the edge of the room and waited until everyone else had finished before she was permitted to gather whatever remained. Some nights, that was a generous portion. Other nights, it was little more than scraped pot scrapings. And she ate them standing, the way she had been taught, without complaint, because complaint had never once changed the outcome. She had asked Mama Uzoma once, as a small child, why she alone stood while everyone else sat. Because a guest does not sit at the family table until the family decides she belongs there, Mama Uzoma had told her, and Nkechi had spent the next 15 years quietly trying to earn a belonging that was never, in fact, available to be earned. Nkechi accepted it too. She had no memory of any other kind of life, and no one had ever suggested to her that one existed. It was in Nkechi's 19th year that Mama Uzoma decided the girl had become, in her own words, more burden than she could continue to carry. The truth was blunter than that, though Mama Uzoma would never have said it aloud. Kelechi was of an age to marry well, and every suitor who came to that house left with his eyes lingering a moment too long on the quiet stepdaughter who served the food rather than on the daughter who was meant to be admired. It had happened 3 times now. Mama Uzoma had run out of patience for a 4th. After turning the problem over for the better part of a week, she found her solution in a trader named Oganamdi, a wealthy man from 2 villages over who had buried 2 wives already and wanted a 3rd young enough to give him sons before he grew too old to enjoy them. He had made his fortune in cattle and cloth, and his compound, everyone agreed, was the finest in the district, a fact Mama Uzoma mentioned often, as though the size of a house could account for everything a marriage might lack. He was not a kind man. Everyone in that district knew it. In the careful, unspoken way that everyone always knows the things nobody says directly. The kind of knowledge passed between women at the market in half-finished sentences and meaningful glances, rather than open accusation. The sort of shared understanding that never quite becomes gossip because everyone is too afraid to be the one who says it plainly. Mama Uzoma presented the match to Nkechi as the opportunity of her life. Mama Uzoma had chosen her moment carefully, waiting until an evening when Nkechi was away visiting a friend, so that the conversation could unfold without any witness to soften or complicate it. A wealthy husband, a house of your own, servants beneath you instead of above you. Do you understand what I am offering you? She had heard the stories, the same careful half-sentences everyone in that district used when discussing Oganamdi's household, and she found herself, for the first time in longer than she could remember, actually voicing a hesitation out loud rather than simply accepting whatever was placed in front of her. I have heard things about Oganamdi, Mama. You have heard jealous gossip from women who wish their own daughters had done half so well. Mama Uzoma's voice was warm, reasonable, entirely convincing to anyone who had not spent 19 years learning to hear what sat beneath her warmth. You are 19 years old. You have no dowry, no family name worth speaking of, and a mark on your body that most men would consider reason enough to refuse you outright. This is not an opportunity. This is the only door that will ever open for a girl in your position, and I am asking you not to let pride close it. Nkechi said yes, because she believed every word of it, and because 19 years of being told she was fortunate simply to be fed had left her with no framework for imagining she deserved anything more than the first door offered to her. She did not know, and would not learn for weeks yet, that Oganamdi had offered Mama Uzoma a bride price considerably larger than his previous 2 marriages, or that her stepmother's urgency to see the match settled had less to do with Nkechi's marriage prospects, and rather more to do with a fear she had been carrying, quietly, for the better part of 2 decades, a fear that had nothing to do with rivalry and everything to do with a shoulder mark. She had spent 19 years teaching a child to be ashamed of, in the hope that shame alone would keep the truth buried forever. Mama Uzoma had told herself, over those 2 decades, 100 different versions of the same reassuring story, that distance would dilute whatever danger the mark represented, that a poor trader's wife would never be looked at closely enough by anyone who mattered, that marrying the girl far away to a man unlikely to bring her within 100 miles of the capital again would finally close a door she had never fully understood the size of. That night, alone on her sleeping mat, Nkechi allowed herself something she rarely permitted: a few minutes of honest fear about the life waiting for her. She had heard the whispers about Oganamdi's first 2 wives, both dead before their time, both spoken of only in careful, unfinished sentences that trailed off before reaching any conclusion, as though even naming what had happened to them too plainly might invite the same fate. She told herself the whispers were exaggeration, the way whispers about wealthy men often were. She was not entirely certain she believed it. She did not see the small, private relief that crossed her stepmother's face when she agreed she would not understand, for a long time yet, exactly what that relief was made of. Not simple riddance, but something closer to fear finally being allowed to breathe. The wedding was set for 1 month out, which Mama Uzoma insisted was generous, but which left barely enough time to prepare anything properly. Oganamdi himself had requested the shortened timeline, citing business obligations that would soon take him away for a season, though Nkechi would later wonder whether haste had served her stepmother's purposes just as well as his. It was a detail Nkechi noticed, and did not question, because questioning things had never once improved her circumstances before. Nkechi, to her limited credit, seemed uneasy about the whole arrangement, though not uneasy enough to say so out loud. You do not have to smile about it, Nkechi. Everyone knows what Oganamdi is. What would you have me do instead? Refuse the only offer that has ever come for me, and stay here another year being told I am fortunate to be fed? Nkechi opened her mouth as though to argue further, then closed it again. She had no real answer to offer, no alternative to propose, only a vague and unformed discomfort that she had never once been taught to act on. In her whole life, no one had ever asked her to imagine what fairness might look like in that household, and she found, in that moment, that she did not know how to begin. Nkechi had no answer for that, because it was true, and both of them knew it. She left Nkechi's doorway that evening, without further protest, though she lingered a moment longer than necessary, one hand resting briefly on the frame as though weighing whether to say something else entirely, as though there were something else she meant to say, and could not quite find the courage for. Nkechi noticed, and filed it away without comment, the way she had learned to file away most things that did not immediately demand a response. That night, Nkechi lay awake longer than usual, one hand resting over the covered mark on her shoulder, the way she often did without quite noticing the habit. She thought, briefly, about her father, and about the words he had never finished saying to her. And then she put the thought away, the way she had learned to put away every thought that led somewhere she could not follow. The weeks that followed were the hardest of Nkechi's life, though she would not fully understand why until much later. Mama Uzoma's cruelty, always present, sharpened into something almost frantic as the wedding date approached. She inspected every garment being prepared for Nkechi, with a fixation that went well beyond ordinary wedding fussiness. And above all, she was obsessive about the shoulder cloth Nkechi would wear to cover the mark. She visited the tailor's small shop 3 times in a single week, each time with new instructions, new adjustments, a fixation that even the wedding itself did not seem to fully explain. Sewn tight, she told the tailor, more than once. It must never slip. Not for a moment, not for any reason. "Do you understand me? You have a fine shoulder for cloth, my dear," the old tailor said once, quietly, while Mama Uzoma's back was turned. "It seems a waste to hide it so completely. But that is not my place to say, I suppose." Nkechi only lowered her eyes, unable to explain 19 years of habit in a single sentence to a stranger. The tailor, a stooped old woman who had made wedding cloth in that village for 40 years, longer than Nkechi herself had been alive, glanced at Nkechi with something like pity, though she said nothing further. It was during one of the final fittings, alone in her room while Mama Uzoma argued with a merchant downstairs, that Nkechi found the cloth. The house was unusually quiet that afternoon. Mama Uzoma occupied downstairs, and Kalichi away visiting neighbors. And Nkechi took advantage of the rare solitude to search properly for a sandal she had misplaced days earlier. She was searching for it beneath her sleeping mat when her hand struck a small wooden box pushed far back against the wall, one she had never seen before, half buried under years of dust. Inside it was a single piece of cloth, old and soft, with age, far finer than anything else in that house, the kind of weave Nkechi had only ever seen on visiting nobles passing through the market. Stitched into one corner, in thread that had once been gold and was now the color of dark honey, was a small bird in flight, wings spread wide, the exact shape of the mark on her own shoulder. Nkechi sat on the floor of that room for a long time, holding the cloth against her chest as though it might warm her, understanding that it meant something, and understanding just as clearly that she had no way to know what. She did not know where it had come from. She did not know why her father had kept it hidden. She only now, with a certainty she could not explain, that this small scrap of cloth was more valuable than everything else she owned combined. She turned the cloth over twice, running her fingers along the stitching, and found herself, without quite meaning to, thinking of her father's hands, the same hands that had once shown her the mark on her own shoulder with such visible tenderness before illness had taken the rest of him from her. Whatever this cloth was, he had kept it close enough to touch, all those years, and never once explained why. She hid it in the folds of her wedding wrapper, close against her body, and told no one. "What are you doing in here?" Mama Uzoma's voice, from the doorway, made Nkechi's whole body go still. "Looking for my sandal, Mama." Her stepmother's eyes moved, very briefly, toward the wooden box, still sitting open on the floor, and something crossed her face that Nkechi had never once seen there before in 19 years. Not anger, not irritation, but something closer to fear. "You should not go through things that are not yours," Mama Uzoma said, and her voice had gone tight and careful. "Whatever is in that box is old rubbish. Leave it where it was." Nkechi had never once heard that particular tightness in her stepmother's voice before. In 19 years of hearing every other register of disapproval she possessed, it did not sound like anger. It sounded, she thought, though she could not have named it at the time, like fear finally being cornered after years of successful hiding. "What was my father keeping in it? Mama, nothing that concerns you." Mama Uzoma closed the box herself, hands not quite steady, and carried it away without another word. Nkechi noticed, though she said nothing, that her stepmother did not return to whatever argument had been waiting for her downstairs. An unusual lapse for a woman who rarely left any dispute unfinished. Instead, she remained in the corridor outside for a long while, and when Nkechi finally crept out to see, she found Mama Uzoma standing perfectly still, staring at nothing, her arms wrapped tightly around the wooden box, as though it might try to escape her. Nkechi did not ask again, but she kept the cloth, and that night, for the first time in years, she found herself thinking not about Oganemdi, or the wedding, or the life waiting for her on the other side of it, but about a question she had never once let herself ask fully. She turned the fine cloth over in the dark, tracing the stitched bird with one finger, feeling the raised texture of thread that had once been gold, and found that the question, once finally allowed to surface, would not go quietly back under again. It sat with her through the rest of the wedding preparations like a second, secret guest, present in every fitting and every rehearsed smile, though she showed none of it outwardly. She began, without quite deciding to, paying closer attention to the small details of her own life. She had never once questioned the exact village Emeka claimed to have found her in, which never seemed to be the same village twice when she pressed for specifics. The absence of any relatives on either side who might have known her before the age of 2, the careful way Mama Uzoma had always steered every conversation about her origins toward vagueness rather than fact. Where did I actually come from? The wedding day arrived bright and overcrowded, because Oganamdi's family, it turned out, had connections that reached considerably higher than a trader's fortune usually allowed. His late brother had served 4 years as a minor court official, and out of old loyalty and the hope of continued royal favor, the family had extended an invitation to the palace itself. Such invitations were customary in that district, a polite gesture rarely taken up in practice, and nobody in that village truly expected it to be accepted. It was accepted, and word of the acceptance arrived only 2 days before the wedding itself, throwing the whole household into a fresh kind of urgency nobody had planned for. Extra cloth ordered overnight, extra food prepared, extra hands borrowed from neighboring families to manage a gathering that had suddenly doubled in importance. Oganamdi himself arrived early, inspecting the arrangements with the proprietary air of a man reviewing livestock he had already purchased, and spared Nkechi exactly one glance the entire morning, brief and assessing, before turning his attention back to his own guests. It was, Nkechi would think much later, the precise measure of what her life had been about to become. Word had spread through the gathering crowd like fire through dry grass. The king himself was coming, along with a modest royal retinue, to honor an old family's wedding with his presence. The whole village turned out early, dressed in whatever finery they owned, and the wedding that had been arranged as a quiet transaction became, without anyone quite intending it, an event the entire district would remember. Mama Uzoma's face, when the news reached her, went through several expressions in quick succession: pride, calculation, and then, briefly, something that looked almost like panic before she mastered it. A sequence so fast that only someone watching as closely as Nkechi happened to be would ever have caught the final expression at all. She repeated it twice more, as though saying it aloud might help her fully absorb the complication it represented. "The king," she said, mostly to herself. "The king will be here." "Is that not a good thing, Mama?" Kelechi asked. "A royal wedding blessing for the family." "Of course, it is a good thing," Mama Uzoma said, too quickly, and turned to find you. "Listen to me carefully. Today of all days, that cloth does not move. Do you understand? Not for a moment. If anyone important is present, you serve quietly. You keep your eyes down, and you do not draw attention to yourself in any way. Can I trust you to manage that much?" "Yes, Mama." "Good." In fact, Mama Uzoma considered a moment longer, and Nkechi watched her stepmother's mind visibly working through calculations she did not share aloud. "You will not sit among the honored guests at all. You will help serve the food, at the back, away from the royal party entirely. It is safer that way." Nkechi, who had expected nothing else her entire life, agreed without protest, and did not notice how carefully her stepmother had just arranged for her to disappear on the one day everyone else in that village would be looking directly at her, The royal party arrived at midday in a modest procession of horses and cloth banners, smaller than legend had led the village to expect, but grander than anything most of them had seen with their own eyes. And the whole courtyard fell into the particular hush that only true power produces. The king was older than Nkechi had imagined, heavier with years than with weight, his face carrying the specific tiredness of a man who has carried something painful for a very long time. He greeted the wedding families with practiced warmth, accepted the seat of honor prepared for him, and settled in to watch a ceremony he had no real stake in. The way important men attend 100 small obligations they will forget by the following week. Mama Uzoma greeted him with the deepest bow anyone in that courtyard had ever seen her perform. Her whole manner transformed into something almost unrecognizably deferential. And for a moment, it seemed the day might pass exactly as she had planned it, a wealthy man's wedding, a royal blessing, a burden finally, permanently removed from her household. Nkechi, standing at the kitchen area near the yard's edge, with a tray balanced on one hip, caught only glimpses of him through the crowd, a flash of rich cloth, the gleam of gold at his ears. Nothing more. Around her, the other kitchen servants whispered excitedly about the honor of hosting royalty, speculating about what such a visit might mean for the village's standing, entirely unaware that the true significance of that afternoon had nothing to do with village standing at all. She had no reason to look longer. She had trays to carry, and a wedding of her own bearing down on her, like whether she had already decided not to fight. Around her, the wedding proceeded exactly as such gatherings always did. Musicians playing, guests exchanging pleasantries they had rehearsed for the occasion, Kalichi seated in fine cloth near the front, accepting compliments, meant, in truth, for a marriage that was not even hers. Nkechi moved through all of it at the edges, as she always had, carrying trays and refilling cups, a familiar kind of invisibility that asked nothing more of her than steady hands and a lowered gaze. The afternoon sun sat high and warm over the whole gathering as she made her way through the crowd, balancing the tray with the ease of long practice, her mind occupied with nothing more urgent than the next task waiting after this one. She did not know, carrying that first tray toward the honored table, that she was walking toward the only conversation that would ever matter in her entire life. If you are already suspecting what that king is about to notice, then do me one small favor before we continue. Tap the like button, and tell me in the comments where you're watching from, because in a few minutes, a whole kingdom's grief is about to end in the middle of a wedding nobody expected to matter. Looking back on it later, she would find it strange how small a thing had changed everything. No grand mistake, no dramatic collision, only the quiet, mundane arithmetic of exhaustion meeting bad luck. It happened in the most ordinary way. Disasters happen, not through any grand mistake, but through a single loose knot Nkechi had tied too hastily that morning, distracted by everything else demanding her attention. She had been awake since long before dawn, managing 100 small tasks nobody else thought to manage, and by midday her hands had grown careless in the particular way exhausted hands always do. She had circled the honored table twice already that afternoon, keeping careful distance out of long habit rather than any specific instruction. But the crowd had grown thick enough near the serving area, guests pressing closer to catch a glimpse of the royal party, that a straight path no longer existed. She was setting down a tray near the edge of the honored table, closer to the royal party than she meant to come, when her foot caught the hem of her own wrapper. She stumbled, caught herself against the table's edge, and in that single unbalanced moment, the carefully sewn shoulder cloth, sewn tight, Mama Uzoma had insisted, for exactly this reason and no other, slipped. Only for a second, only far enough to bear her shoulder to the open air. It was more than enough. Nearby servants noticed first, exchanging startled glances, unsure whether to look away out of propriety or stare out of simple human curiosity. Neither instinct mattered in the end, because the one person whose attention had already fixed itself entirely on that small bared shoulder was not looking away at all. The king went very still. Nkechi, mortified, fumbled the cloth back into place immediately, certain her clumsiness alone was the disaster, entirely unaware that something far larger than an exposed shoulder had just happened in front of 300 witnesses. For a long moment, nothing happened at all. The king simply stared, and the ordinary noise of the wedding continued around him, oblivious, until his stillness became noticeable enough that the musicians faltered and the gathered conversation slowly died away into confused silence. "Girl." The king's voice cut across the gathered noise, quiet, but carrying in the particular way that authority carries without needing volume. "Come here!" The whole courtyard turned to look. Guests who had spent the morning discussing crop prices and marriage negotiations now found themselves witness to something none of them could yet name, though every instinct in that gathered crowd told them it mattered. Nkechi approached with her head down, certain she was about to be publicly reprimanded for her clumsiness in front of the most important man any of them had ever hosted. She had already begun composing an apology in her mind. "Show me your shoulder," the king said. "The mark, show me again." A ripple of confused murmuring moved through the crowd, 300 guests straining to understand what could possibly have stopped a king mid-ceremony for the sake of a serving girl's shoulder. Nkechi's hands went still. Across the courtyard, she saw her stepmother rising from her seat, her face gone, the color of old ash. "My king, forgive her. It is only a birthmark." "Nothing worth. I did not ask you," the king sighed, without even turning to look at Mama Uzoma, and something in his tone made the whole courtyard fall completely silent, the kind of silence that arrives when 300 people simultaneously understand they are witnessing something they will describe to their grandchildren. "I asked her." Her hands shook as she reached for the knot, fumbling once before her fingers finally obeyed her. Every eye in that courtyard, 300 strong, had turned to watch a serving girl do something no one present fully understood the weight of yet. Nkechi, trembling now, drew the shoulder cloth aside herself. Chairs scraped against the ground as several attendants moved instinctively to intervene, uncertain what was happening but sensing, correctly, that it was not ordinary. The king rose from his seat entirely, crossed the small distance between them, and stared at the mark the way a man stares at something he has spent years being told could not possibly exist. "A bird in flight," he said, quietly, almost to himself, one hand rising involuntarily toward his own chest as though something there had suddenly grown difficult to bear. Wings spread wide. Exactly. So, behind him, the royal attendants had gone still and watchful, exchanging glances that suggested none of them had ever once seen their king behave this way in public, in 19 years of quiet, careful grief. He looked up at her, and his eyes had filled with something Nkechi could not name, not anger, not simple curiosity, but a kind of desperate, disbelieving hope. "Where," he said, "did you get that mark? Who raised you, child? Tell me everything, and leave nothing out." The whole courtyard held its breath, 300 people suspended in a silence so complete that the afternoon bird-song from the trees beyond the walls seemed suddenly, absurdly low. Nkechi looked at the king, and then, helplessly, at her stepmother, whose face had gone rigid with a fear 19 years in the making, and understood, in that single frozen moment, that whatever question had just been asked of her, the true answer was not one she possessed. "I do not know, my king," she said, her voice breaking. "I have never known where I came from. My father found me. That is all I have ever been told. Send for any idioma." The king sighed to no one and everyone at once. "Now, immediately. Do not let anyone leave this courtyard until she arrives." Mama Uzoma tried twice to interject, first with protests that the wedding could not simply be halted, then with increasingly frantic insistence that the mark meant nothing, that the king was mistaking an ordinary birthmark for something it could not possibly be. Each time, a single look from the king silenced her more completely than any words could have, and the gathered crowd, sensing the shift in power taking place before them, began to draw back from her instinctively, the way people draw back from something they have only just realized might be dangerous. Word of the summons spread through the palace faster than any messenger could carry it, and by the time any idioma arrived, a small crowd of curious court attendants had gathered at a respectful distance, sensing that something unprecedented was unfolding. Any idioma arrived within the hour, an ancient woman so old she required 2 attendants simply to walk, but whose eyes, when they finally settled on Nkechi's bared shoulder, went sharp and clear in an instant. "Turn her toward the light," the old woman said. "Fully. I need to see it exactly." The whole courtyard leaned forward as one, 300 people holding their breath around a single old woman's careful examination. She studied the mark for a long moment, her thin hands trembling slightly, tracing the outline of the wings with the same reverent care a person might use to touch something sacred, and then she looked up at the king with an expression that answered his question before she said a single word. "My king." Her voice, though frail, carried across the whole silent courtyard. "I delivered that child myself, 19 years ago. I would know this mark anywhere. It is the royal mark, exactly as it has always been described in the old birth records. A bird in flight, in that precise position, on the left shoulder. I have seen it only once before in my whole life. On the night your daughter was born." Nkechi Gioma steadied herself against her two attendants and turned to address the gathered crowd directly, her ancient voice somehow carrying to every corner of that courtyard despite its frailty. "I attended the birth of the true princess of this kingdom 19 years ago. I marked this exact sign in the royal birth record myself, in my own, because the queen insisted her daughter's mark be recorded precisely in case it was ever needed as proof. I did not imagine, in all my remaining years, that I would live to see that proof called upon." The courtyard erupted into disbelieving murmurs, silenced only when the king raised his hand again. He seemed, for a moment, to age a decade in front of the whole watching courtyard. 19 years of carefully managed grief cracking open all at once. "The flood," he said, his voice unsteady now in a way it had not been even moments before. "The river crossing 19 years ago." Nkechi Gioma nodded slowly. "The night the queen drowned, trying to save her. The night we believed we lost the princess to the water as well. Nkechi's whole body had gone cold. I do not understand. What are you saying to me?" It was the king who answered, his composure entirely gone now, his voice raw. 19 years ago, my wife and infant daughter were swept away during a flood at the river crossing, on our way home from a neighboring kingdom. My wife did not survive. My daughter's body was never found. The whole kingdom mourned her as dead, and I have spent 19 years believing I buried both the women I loved in that river." His hand trembled visibly as it moved toward her, an old man's hand that had signed treaties and commanded armies, now uncertain how to touch his own daughter for what felt, to him, like the very first time. He reached out, very slowly, as though she might vanish if he moved too quickly, and touched the mark on her shoulder with something close to reverence. "But a river does not always keep what it takes," he said. "Sometimes it only carries it somewhere else." It was then that Nkechi remembered the cloth. She drew it from where it had been folded against her body since the day she found it. The small bird stitched into its corner, catching the afternoon light, and held it out with hands that would not stop shaking. Nkechi Gioma made a sound that was not quite a word at all. One thin hand pressed suddenly to her own chest, as though the shock of it had reached all the way into her old bones. "That is the queen's own shawl," she whispered. "I helped weave the border myself. She wrapped the infant princess in it the very day she was born. My king, this is not coincidence. This is proof." The king took the cloth in both hands, pressing it briefly to his face, the way a man might press something to remind himself it is real, and for a long moment he could not speak at all. "Mama Uzoma." Every head in that courtyard turned toward her at once. The collective weight of 300 stares landing on a woman who had spent 19 years making certain no one looked at her too closely. "You knew," the king said, and it was not a question. "You have known, or suspected, for a very long time. That is the only explanation for a shoulder cloth, sewn shut so tightly it required an accident to reveal what has been in front of you for 19 years. "Mama." Uzoma's composure finally broke. "Entirely, my husband found her," she said, the words tumbling out now, no longer controlled. "Half-drowned, downriver, wrapped in that very cloth, when Nkechi was barely 2 years old. He never told me where he found her exactly, only that he could not leave a dying infant on a riverbank. He meant to find her family. Eventually, he always meant to. He said so 100 times. But the years passed, and he grew attached to her, and then he died before he ever did anything about it, and I was left with a girl I had always suspected was worth more than everything I owned, and no idea what to do with that knowledge, except bury it." "So you buried her instead," the king said quietly. 19 years of bearing a truth that was never yours to keep. "I raised her," Mama Uzoma said, weakly now, her voice barely carrying to the front of the crowd anymore. "I fed her, I kept her safe." "You kept her small," said the king. "There is a difference, and I think, in your heart, you have always known it." The crowd around them had gone entirely silent, 300 people absorbing, in real time, the shape of a lie that had shaped an entire girl's life without her ever once suspecting it. Somewhere near the back, someone began to weep quietly, though no one turned to see who. The wedding did not proceed. Oga Namdi, to his family's visible relief, withdrew from the arrangement within the hour, offering no protest at all. A poor trader's daughter had been one thing. A lost princess, with a grieving king for a father, was an entirely different matter, and even a hard man knew better than to argue with that particular reversal of fortune. Mama Uzoma was not driven from the village, nor punished with cruelty, to match her own, though more than one voice in the crowd called for exactly that kind of justice in the tense minutes before the king spoke. The king, when the moment came to decide her fate, chose something quieter and, in its way, more exacting. The whole courtyard waited, certain some far harsher sentence was coming. "You will remain in this village," he told her, in front of the full assembled crowd, "and you will speak, once every year, on this same date, of what you did and why not. For the crowd's satisfaction, but so that no one in this district ever again mistakes silence for kindness or secrecy for protection. That is the whole of your punishment. I suspect, in time, you will find it heavier than anything crueler I could have ordered instead." Nkechi returned to the palace that same week, escorted by a full royal guard that treated her with a careful, almost disbelieving gentleness she was not yet accustomed to receiving. And the kingdom that had mourned her for 19 years greeted her homecoming with a celebration that lasted 3 full days. The first week alone taught her more about her new life than she had expected. She was given a room larger than her stepmother's entire house, its windows overlooking a garden more carefully tended than any farm she had ever worked, attended by servants who addressed her with a deference she found, at first, almost unbearable to receive, and presented with wardrobes of cloth, so fine she was afraid, for several days, to actually wear any of it. She did not let it change the essential shape of who she was, though she noticed, in quieter moments, how strange it felt to be looked at directly now, instead of past. She remembered too clearly what it felt like to be the girl serving food at the edge of a courtyard, invisible to everyone who mattered, and she made certain, in every decision she made from that day forward, that no one in her father's kingdom would ever again be treated as though their worth could be measured by the cloth they wore or the family whose name they carried. In the days before she left the village for good, it was Calacier, to everyone's quiet surprise, who came to find her first. Standing awkwardly in the doorway of the room Nkechi had slept in for 19 years, twisting her hands together in a way Nkechi had never once seen her do before. "I did not know," Kaliki said, her voice unsteady. "I want you to believe that. I did not know, and I never once asked the questions I should have asked. I have spent every night since the wedding thinking about all the small moments I could have noticed if I had only been willing to look properly." "I believe you," Nkechi said, and found, somewhat to her own surprise, that she meant it. "You were kept small too. In your own way, your mother simply built your smallness out of comfort instead of scarcity." At the palace she found herself, in time, in the quiet company of the king's young cousin, Prince Obia, who had been present at the wedding as part of the royal retinue, and who had watched the whole impossible afternoon unfold with an expression Nkechi did not fully understand until much later. Not simple astonishment, but something gentler underneath it, the particular attention of a man noticing a person for the first time rather than a spectacle. He did not rush her. Their first real conversation happened almost by accident. In a palace garden neither of them had expected the other to be walking through, and it lasted far longer than either of them intended, covering nothing more significant than favorite foods and half-remembered childhood songs. In the months that followed, he found reasons to seek her out at the edges of court gatherings, asking after her father Emeka's memory more than her royal blood, treating the 19 years of her ordinary life as something worth knowing rather than something to be erased in favor of the crown that now sat uneasily, on her recovered identity. "You are allowed to have loved the life you actually lived," he told her once, when she confessed how strange it felt to be celebrated for a birth she remembered nothing of. "A person is not required to choose between two families. You may grieve the father who raised you and claim the father who lost you, both at once, and neither one lessens the other." She thought about that conversation often in the months that followed, turning it over the way she had once turned over a scrap of gold-stitched cloth in a dark room, uncertain of its full meaning, but certain, somehow, that it mattered more than almost anything else she had ever been told. It was, Nkechi thought, the first time anyone in her whole life had given her permission to hold her own story without shame. The old shoulder cloth, mended and framed, was placed in the palace's own archive beside the birth record it finally confirmed, and Nkechi visited it often, not because she needed proof of who she was anymore, but because it reminded her of the version of herself who had once hidden a piece of gold-stitched cloth against her body and told no one, trusting nothing but her own instinct that it mattered. She kept the mark uncovered from that day forward, and found, in the first weeks of doing so, that the habit of covering it had run so deep she sometimes still reached instinctively for a shoulder cloth that was no longer there. Each time she caught herself doing it, she made a small, private decision to leave her shoulder bare instead. A quiet act of defiance against 19 years of learned shame that no one but she fully understood the weight of. She wore it the way her father, Emeka, had first shown her to wear it, before shame had ever entered the picture as something beautiful, not something to apologize for. And when children in the kingdom asked her, in later years, why a princess would keep an old scrap of cloth in a palace full of finer things, she always gave them the same answer. "Because for 19 years, everyone who looked at me saw only what I was hiding," she would say. And it took one small accident, one loosened knot, to teach an entire kingdom that a mark you are ashamed to show is very often the exact mark that was always meant to set you free. Thank you for joining us for this story. Subscribe to Untold African Folktales Stories and click the bell so you never miss a story. Watch our next story here.